to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Anjali Krishnamurti.
And my name is Bahar Muradi, and we are incredibly excited to introduce ourselves as the new incoming co-chairs of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee.
We look forward to leading the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee in bringing timely discussions to the stage and designing events that highlight student discourse on campus and relevant ongoing affairs. Our speakers tonight will discuss Trump's return to the White House and what it will mean both domestically and abroad.
Our conversation will touch on the economy, the Middle East, competition with China, and much more. We are truly honored to introduce our panelists tonight, beginning with Graham Allison, who is the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard University and former Assistant Secretary of Defense. Next, we have Jason Furman, who is the Aetna Professor of the Practice of Economic Policy and the former Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And we also have Megan O'Sullivan, who is the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and the Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs.
Dan Balls is the chief correspondent at the Washington Post and a senior fellow here at the Institute of Politics. Cornell William Brooks is the professor of the Practice of Public Leadership and Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School and the former CEO and president of the NAACP. And finally, this conversation will be moderated by Brittany Shepard, a national politics reporter for ABC News and a new IOP Spring 2025 resident fellow.
Now, please join us in welcoming our distinguished speakers to the stage.
I think I need I don't even need a microphone, I'm wearing a microphone. Good evening, everyone. Hi, like you heard, I'm Brittany Shepard, one of the newest resident fellows here, alongside my other lovely resident fellows here in the front row at the IOP. And hello, Zoom land, hello, virtual land. We're so excited for you to be here at this conversation, because it's been a really slow couple of news weeks, right? Yeah, nothing's been going on that could fill an hour. There's just so much that we could talk about. I'm really excited for a dynamic conversation. Don't hold back in your questions. I'm really excited to hear from you in just about half an hour, 40 minutes time. And I want to start with all of us here on our favorite topic, public opinion polling. But seriously, a couple weeks ago, I was reading through a Quinnipiac poll, and there was this finding that really struck me. It found that a majority of voters, around 54%, are actually optimistic about the next 4 years under Donald Trump. So as it pertains to all your various fields of expertise, my question is, are you? And for this one, we'll start here and work down, but feel free to, be collaborative in your answers going forward.
Well, so at Davos this year, the fellow who runs at Klaus Schwab, who actually is a graduate of what became the Kennedy School, said, be constructively optimistic. That was the declaration. So I made a bet publicly, you can see it on their whatever stream, that this time next year, we will have been surprised on the upside in relations between the US and China. And I understand that's looking for a silver lining and that's stretching, but since I think that's the most important relationship in the world, and that's the relationship that could most likely end in a war that would be catastrophic for all of us, I'm sticking by my bet.
I like it. We'll have to follow back in 4 years to see, your payout.
This is just for 1 year. 1 year.
1 year. Okay. So even sooner, we'll see what the payout is.
Got it.
Dan, what about you?
Well, I'm a Midwesterner, and we are generally optimistic by nature. But I think that number that you cited is similar to what it was 8 years ago when Donald Trump was first elected. Yeah. We saw what happened in that first term. We saw what happened in the term when President Biden was in office. We've seen what's happened in the last few weeks. And so I would say I'm not necessarily overly optimistic at where we are heading. I mean, the turmoil that he is unleashing at this point is something we've never seen before, and we will have to watch it play out. But I think everybody is kind of back on their heels about where this is going.
Sure. But the home field advantage in D.C. is a little bit different, though, than last time. both chambers, all the swing states. I was out at the RNC, we both talked to voters a lot. There seems to be an optimism, a cheeriness about Trump, both from his base and maybe from the Trump curious. I just didn't feel like it was in the bloodstream the first time around, so I'm curious, how that all percolates in Washington, as the Republicans hold all of the power. SCOTUS, of course, as well.
Well, I think there's a couple of differences. One is that in winning both the popular vote and a quite comfortable electoral majority, I think people look at that victory in a different way. I also think that there are perceptions of the Democratic Party, and we may get into that, which are different today than they would have been after 2016. So I think that that people have I won't say they've come to terms with this Trump victory, particularly the people who were in opposition. But I think people recognize that he is the president. Whatever people think about him, you have to acknowledge he made a remarkable comeback. If we were sitting here 4 years ago, the idea that he would be the president of the United States today, I think nobody would have taken that bet. And so I think that has affected perceptions of what people at least are prepared for. But again, as I say, I'm not sure people were prepared for what we've seen already.
Yeah, and we'll have a lot to say about the Democrats and what now a little bit later this evening.
Okay.
Cornell, I could kind of guess what your answer might be, but I'm curious, are you optimistic?
Well, first of all, let me just say at the outset, thank you to the IOP staff and students for putting on this event. And notwithstanding the anti-DEI executive orders and directives, happy Black History Month.
Now, happy Black History Month.
So I am optimistic, but I'm optimistic because people retain the ability to be optimistic, which will be the reservoir of resilience and agency that they will need as this president leads this racist, xenophobic, democracy-destroying assault on our institutions. We need to be very clear about where we are. We cannot sugarcoat this. We cannot get wrapped up in the fact that he won somewhat decisively. Our democratic institutions are under assault. Government workers are under assault. FBI agents are under assault. The Department of Justice, where I once worked, is under assault. I believe because our people have the capacity to be optimistic, to be hopeful, that they want change, means that they will recognize the attack on our country and be able to resist it.
And there's certainly millions of Americans who agree with you, and Democrats who are trying to grapple of what to do, and even just career folks in the government who have worked under many administrations who have gotten emails saying a fork in the road, that's coded for, right? That maybe it's time for you to go and maybe to take out these buyouts. And that could be a whole hour, of course, so we'll get back to you on that too. Sure. I think, Megan, as it pertains to the Middle East, what say you?
Sure. First, welcome, Brittany. It's great to have you part of HKS. I think I'm curious as to the date on the poll. You said a few weeks ago.
Yeah, it was about a week and change ago.
Oh, okay. Because it's interesting that, as I think my colleagues has suggested, a lot of what's happened, people were expecting disruption, but it's at a higher level than I think people anticipated. So I would be curious about that. Mm-hmm. But to answer your question, although I know Americans probably didn't answer that poll related to foreign policy, I would say that it really depends on where you sit. So from a Middle East perspective, I think there are a lot of opportunities that could be realized here. I think there is grounds for optimism, which is not saying that this is inevitable, but there's certainly possibilities there. If you're sitting in Europe, it's much harder to be optimistic. A combination of what's happening in the European economies and what's happening in Ukraine, on top of an American presidency that is not particularly overtly invested in the transatlantic relationship. I think it's very hard to be optimistic if you're there. So I think it's hard to give a up or down, thumbs up or down on foreign policy. I think the big enchilada is what Graham said, the U.S.-China relationship. And there, it's hard to read Donald Trump, but one could make a strong case that he's looking for a better relationship, even though maybe most of the people he's appointed are not.
Right. And he said publicly, Graham, we were talking about this earlier this week, that he respects Xi, and I think we'll have to get into just the whirlwind on the tariffs. Even just today, I got like 4 push notifications. Like, wait, can I get a package from China? Like, do we get makeup now or later? So we'll have much to talk about there too. And I want to end on Jason on that. Oh, sorry, Megan.
No, I'm just, so Harvard has this institutional voice policy, and as a director of a center, I'm obliged to say that I'm speaking to you in my personal capacity.
Retweets are not endorsements here on this stage.
Director of the Belfer Center,
right.
The director of the Belfer.
And I appreciate that, and I assume it applies to all of us here today. Jason?
I'm also not speaking on behalf of any center that I'm not a director of. I want to make that very clear. So, first of all, when it comes to the economy, there's lots of when something goes well, the president must have been a genius, and when something goes badly, they must have been terrible. But the main thing that's going to matter for the economy over the next several years is things like productivity growth and innovation. And so for economic growth over the next couple of years, it might be that DeepSeek R1 was the most important thing that happened on January 20th, not the person who was sworn into office that day. The person who was sworn into office that day probably is facing enough constraints from things like the stock market, the legal system. I think reality can occasionally be a little bit constraining, that the impact he'll end up having on the economy is more like plus or minus tenths than the sort of more apocalyptic mindset might have of could destroy everything and the like. Now, the caveat to all of that, or the downside to all of that, is there are a lot of things the market doesn't care about. The market could care less about whether or not we're saving lives of children around the world from AIDS. It's not going to go down if you shut down a program like PEPFAR. So there are things where that set of constraints in reality really, I do think, will be more constraining than people appreciate. But there'll be large swaths that arguably are more important than whether our GDP growth rate is 2.1, 2.3, or 2.7, where you won't have those constraints.
So, Jason, you're saying that Donald Trump can't make the price of groceries $20 for a month, or make it affordable for my generation to buy a house. Is that what you're saying?
The only way he could actually bring down the price of groceries would be a massive recession.
Well, that's optimistic to hear. And like I was saying at the outset, there's just a tremendous amount of headlines and news that have broken just the last 24 hours. But I think we have to start with news on the Middle East. And Megan, I'm going to go to you. Over the last few weeks, Trump said that the U.S. should take over at least 4 territories or countries. That's Greenland, Canada, maybe as a joke, asterisk there, unclear, the Panama Canal, and most recently, Gaza. His suggestion is that America take over Gaza and make it, in his words, the Riviera of the Middle East. How is the world reacting? Yeah, a couple loaded questions for you, so just an easy one to start. So how is the world reacting? What are the geopolitical implications here? And how likely is it that the world will see Trump tower Gaza effectively in the next few years?
Can I add one more question?
Yes, of course.
Are you selling Riviera condos in Gaza yet?
No, and I doubt anyone will be. But let me back up and just say, I think many of us, when we got that ticker on our phone, blinked more than once. On the surface, it's very perplexing. And even when you dig deeper down, it is hard to understand that a president that is so dedicated to pulling out of the Middle East, to not being overtly engaged abroad, would make such a claim. But if you think about it a little bit, we are already seeing patterns that are recognizable in President Trump's strategy and behavior from the first administration, which is to change a conversation with a very, very seemingly outrageous statement. And I think that's exactly what he did. If you think about what everyone was focused on in the 48 hours running up to Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, going to Washington, D.C., it was this whole question of how was Prime Minister Netanyahu going to square this circle? He's got a coalition that is intent upon him returning to war and not going ahead with the ceasefire, yet he's promised the Americans he's going to stay in the ceasefire. These seem to be completely unreconcilable. Is President Trump, if you talk to leaders in the Arab world, they all thought they're optimistic President Trump is going to force a Palestinian state on Prime Minister Netanyahu. Has anyone been talking about any of that? No. They've all been talking about Gaza because President Trump comes in and he makes a statement not just about the Riviera and about the U.S. owning Gaza, but more importantly, from an Arab perspective, he talks about displacing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians or having them move into new places, which, for those of you that don't follow the Middle East, is a traumatic triggering of an experience in 1948 where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were pushed out of their homes and remain refugees in other lands. So it's referred to as the Nakba among Arabs. It means the catastrophe. And suddenly President Trump is saying, here's the solution to the problem. Let's do something similar. And what this does is it changes the conversation entirely. Yeah. And it actually gives Netanyahu an ability to go back to Israel, say to his right wing, don't get focused on the ceasefire. Look at the big picture, is that Israel is going to get sort of what this part of the political spectrum is interested in, which is removing Palestinians from territory. So in a way, it is not the crazy statement that many of us thought. Now, what really matters is what happens next week when the King of Jordan comes to the White House and when the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia comes to Washington. How does the Trump administration and President Trump talk to them to say, okay, let's go from where I have set the conversation and see what we can make out of this that is more agreeable and leads to a continuation of the ceasefire and, ostensibly something better. This will be a lot of jiu-jitsu. I'm not saying this is an obvious secret plan that is destined to succeed, but, I think it's a little more interesting than it seems at first blush.
And Mike here would be the first to tell you these meetings don't happen on accident. The schedule of who visits the White House and when is planned, weeks, months, in advance if they can. So what do you think it means that Netanyahu was the first to visit Trump, and this deal, no doubt, was discussed in how Netanyahu and Trump want to pretend their relationship going forward?
Well, I don't think anyone is surprised that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu are likely to have a close relationship as they did before. I don't know, some people talk about there are tensions underneath the surface. I don't think it's that surprising. I think when we hear President Trump talk about some of his foreign policy ambitions, they overtly involve the Nobel Peace Prize and, in the context of the Middle East. So again, I'm not a mind reader here, but, I expect that President Trump is very, very focused on the normalization of relationships between Saudi Arabia and Israel. This is what he considers, I imagine, to be unfinished business from his first administration, which did usher in very historic reestablishments of relationships between Israel and Arab states, not Saudi Arabia. So this is something that would fundamentally transform the region for the better, and that he and people in his administration see as like the next, natural step. And now, because of the tragedy of October 7th and everything that has happened to Palestinians and other Arabs after that, now the fate of the Palestinians is deeply, deeply entwined in that.
Sure, of course.
So I agree completely with Megan, but I think just to push a little further. So would there have been a ceasefire and exchange of hostages absent Trump? I believe the answer is no. A lot of the work had been done, but until he exercised some leverage that the Biden team had not been prepared to do, and even people that I know well in the Biden team agree with that proposition. So that's the first thing. So that first stage is going to give out very shortly, and there's a question about what's going to happen in the second phase with more ceasefire and exchange. So I think Megan's proposition about changing the conversation to make that almost this comes by the wayside while this other big conversation is going on. Of course, you can't go back to fighting. So I think the chances of riding through to the second phase is much larger now, given that initiative.
I agree with that. I think it's counterintuitive to many people, but I think it's more likely that the ceasefire will hold for longer after all this talk about Gaza for the reasons I stated, that Netanyahu goes back to Israel with something to say to people. It is in our interest to a big swath. I mean, a huge amount of Israelis are deeply, deeply invested in getting the remaining hostages out. So there is a political reason to continue with the ceasefire, as well as the humanitarian reason and so many other reasons. But he has a political problem that I think Trump is trying to help him solve. So I'm hopeful that actually the ceasefire, its prospects are better than it was, yesterday.
And while we're overseas, I want to bring Jason and Graham into this conversation about China. Like I was saying, in the matter of 24 hours, we weren't getting any parcels from Hong Kong and China, and now we are. So let me just ask you a pretty easy one. Are we in the middle of a major trade war? What is the fate there? Jason, you want to start?
Yeah, it's really interesting how people think in comparative terms. In President Trump's first term, it felt like this epic trade war with China. There was so many articles on it, so much writing, so much drama. But when you look back, it took nearly 18 months before the first set of tariffs. That first set of tariffs was only on about $40 billion of imports from China. What was done this week was on $500 billion of imports from China, including the really small Temu stuff that you all order that wasn't coming for 24 hours.
No, we're on TikTok Shop now. We're off Temu. We're on something else.
And when you look at something like the effective tariff rate on average on China, what went into effect on Tuesday this week was about twice as much as the entire 4 years of Trump's first term as president. So he did a very, very large thing vis-a-vis China, but somehow it felt smaller because there wasn't the same wind-up, there wasn't the same rhetoric, and of course, he jettisoned the much, much, much bigger and more consequential 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. So we're in the middle of something that is, quite serious. It's interesting, the Chinese have responded differently. That first round of tariffs in the first Trump administration, China did dollar for dollar on exactly the same magnitude of U.S. exports to China that we had done of Chinese exports to the United States, exactly the same tariff rate. This time they put tariffs on about $30 billion of imports coming from the United States. Those tariffs are delayed. They did a few other things related to critical minerals, an investigation of Google, some things on the entity list, but it was a very small response that was designed to be, ours was sort of scattershot across the board, like shoot in every direction. China's was very well designed to cause more harm to the United States than to China, but the magnitude is very small. So it's still a pretty small amount to the United States and an even smaller amount to China. So to me, all of that's interesting. The large size of what the United States has done, the contrast between that and what was done on TikTok in terms of delaying the effective date, the smaller response of China, and all of this operating at a rhetorical level that's much, much calmer, even while at an economic level, in some ways or in many ways, more serious.
Right, and to the fact that the impact is more serious. Is any part of this, in your estimation, and Graham, I'm curious what your posture is too, Trump trying to show President Xi, don't mess with me, like I am going to reintroduce myself as a strongman of all strongmen who didn't know what you were dealing with, 4 or 8 years ago. Do you think that's part of the calculation at all, or is it purely economic?
I think it's bargaining. Well, go ahead.
No. Yeah. I want to hear what you think.
I think it's bargaining. I think that it's theatrical to start with, and Jason's point is just right. The first headlines were 25% tariffs on our two closest neighbors and 10% tariffs on China. And that's the headline that ran everywhere. And that's actually what most people probably still think happened. Then the 25% was actually postponed, okay? The 10% then implemented. And I think all this is run up to negotiation between two people who know each other very well, respect each other, as Trump said over and over in the campaign. Trump's, as you and I were talking earlier about this, I published a piece in the Washington Post today offering some quotations from Trump in the campaign. In the campaign, he says, "I like Xi." He says, "Xi is brilliant." He says, "My press people tell me, don't say this, but I'm telling you, I know him, he's brilliant." So he's very respectful of Xi, or behaving very respectfully, and Xi, I think, similarly. So I think we'll watch this process pretty quickly. My bet would be, I bet his first trip will be to China.
Yeah.
And they will be talking about, most importantly in the first instance, Ukraine, and trying to get a conclusion to that. So I would take it as bargaining. Yeah.
I mean, there's a question, I'd be curious what you and Meg and others think, about how credible our threats are. Yeah. China has now observed that we went from 25% tariffs on Canada to 0 in exchange for them naming a fentanyl czar. And we went from 25 to 0 on Mexico in exchange for them keeping the same number of troops that were already on the border. I saw one tweet saying that he was going to put tariffs on France if they didn't agree to eat croissants. That France was going to come and say, "Fine, we'll eat croissants," and then the tariffs would be off. I think the Chinese are probably more savvy about understanding that dynamic than some of his most fervent and enthusiastic supporters, who thinks he accomplished more with these things than I think he accomplished with them. And so the question is, did he help his leverage by looking like he was willing to do really, really big things, or did he hurt his leverage by making massive threats and getting really, really tiny things in exchange for them?
Well, if you go back to Trump 1, so what was the greatest deal in the century, okay, as was announced and written about in the press? And it was the phrase of one of a trade deal between the U.S. and China, which, if you're looking, graphing growth, inflation, you can't even see a bump, okay?
And China didn't follow through on its agreement and was never really called on it by the Trump administration.
There was COVID, and then there was the weak Biden administration, according to Trump, and therefore I suspect he'll come back to the $200 billion and want that in the picture. But I think it's all bargaining.
The second biggest accomplishment was redoing the North American Free Trade Agreement.
It was,
and he arrived in office this year and said, "We're still getting, hammered by our allies, our friends, and we need to redo things."
And he would say that was then and this is now.
Well, or a short memory, or
betting on people's short memory is probably how all of us in Washington, I think, operate. And Cornell, I know we haven't had a chance to go to you yet, and there's so much I want to talk to everyone about, like, will I be able to afford a house in this lifetime? And many of the people here in this audience, can they even afford living? But maybe in the Q&A we'll get there. Cornell is such a fractious time socially. And we haven't really talked about what that means domestically, and I want to talk to you two about, who cares? It'll fall. Thank you, Graham. And the targets seem to change over time. I remember just 3 years ago, I thought every story I was going to write was about CRT, and then it's DEI. It's like war of the acronyms here. And they've become really loaded, that what they actually mean to me is quite empty now. What do you think this says about this moment, that there are folks in the federal government who are just trying to diversify and make sure there's equity, that seems to be being unspooled? At least if you're a Democrat or progressive, you might be worried. So I'm curious what you think about that, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So when we think about DEI in the present moment with respect to the president, I think it's important for us to appreciate that we're not talking about ceremonial extravagances. So this is not merely about abolishing Holocaust Remembrance Day, not merely about abolishing Hispanic Heritage Month or Black History Month or Women's History Month. This is about literally the racial weaponization of the federal workforce. How so? When the president issues an anti-DEI executive order, but the way it's implemented means that we're collecting the names of federal employees who have attended diversity workshops, right? And we target them. That is a violation of federal law, right? That's the Civil Rights Act. That's the Fair Employment Act. That is not lawful. So this is not about what you celebrate or what you decline to celebrate. That's racial discrimination. So let's be very clear about that. Where we have federal officials who, at the moment of an aviation disaster, the worst such disaster in 20+ years, when bodies are still at the bottom of the Potomac, a plane and a helicopter is still at the bottom of the Potomac, and we have federal officials saying this would have been prevented but for DEI. And we have people saying we need competent white men without looking at the black box, without engaging in any kind of investigative report. Let's be clear. This is rank racism that does what? It professionally impugns people who work in the federal workforce and in our military. Let's be clear about this. When we have the Secretary of Defense, right, talking about we need more white men. Well, let's think about 2 black men.
Pete Hegseth, you're talking about.
That's right, Pete Hegseth. 2 black men. What about Benjamin O. Davis Sr., right, who was a brigadier general, who was one of the pioneering black generals, and his son, who was a pioneering black general in the Air Force, the first in the Army, the second in the Air Force. What about those people? So my point being here is we're in a moment where we have not only people being professionally impugned, their character, we have jobs being taken, careers at risk, but beyond that, what are we saying to federal prosecutors who are prosecuting civil rights cases?
Right, because that was my question. What is your confidence in the courts, wherever they exist?
I have confidence in the courts. I do not have confidence in the people charged with responsibility of law enforcement. Right? So when we cow our FBI agents, that's a problem. When we appoint someone as the head of the Civil Rights Division with no experience in civil rights, this is a complex body of law, right? Where you need competent people who've tried cases, who've done investigations, who know what to do, and who can elicit the trust of people. You can't do an investigation unless people trust you. And so if you gut these agencies, diminish diversity, when you do an investigation, you have to have people who can go out into communities and get people to trust them. You need a diverse workforce. So my point being here is this whole matter of diversity is not about what holidays we celebrate. Right? It's not about making people feel good on the basis of race and ethnicity. It's about the competent, meritocratic operation of government. When you gut the CIA, right, in terms of diverse employees, diverse skill sets, have diverse language skills, that's a problem. When you gut the military in a similar fashion, that's a problem. Last point here. Our military has been a petri dish for social progress, right? So we had desegregation there under President Truman before Brown versus Board of Education. So now we have an incompetent, ignorant group of people gutting the military or demoralizing the military, even as they demoralize the federal government, all under the name of diversity and DEI.
Wow. And I want to bring
gone so far from the optimism we began.
Well, we'll get back there, but I think this
optimism is predicated on moral candor.
This is an important point I think Cornell brings up, and I want to bring Dan here because I think many people watching and folks I've talked to who are Democrats are saying, well, where are the Democrats to stand up and message against this? Where do they go from there? You know, Dan, what have you seen of what the Democrats have done in the first few weeks of this presidency? Do you see much fight back?
No, not yet. I think the Democrats are quite on the defensive, still trying to digest what happened in November. Mike Donilon would say the Democratic Party's in not as bad a shape as many people think, and I would say they're not in as good a shape as Mike Donilon might be saying. So, look,
for those of you who don't know, Mike is a fellow at the AOP this semester and was part of the Biden political leadership.
And we'll be doing a forum next week on inside the Oval Office.
If I survive this one.
We all promote each other's work here at the Kennedy School.
I think of this in a couple of different time frames.
Sure.
The immediate time frame for the Democrats is how do they stand up in this moment against Trump? And it's not clear that they know quite what to do.
Yeah.
But they're going to have to find a way to, in a vigorous way, present an opposition to Trump. So that's the first order of business. Yeah. They have a new chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Ken Martin, who's been the chair at the Minnesota Party. He can do some things, but that's more of a mechanic's role to get the party in shape for future elections.
Yeah, fundraise, recruit, things
It's going
like
to
that
depend on other people for that. That's the first, priority. The second will be the midterm elections. And, if history is any guide, the Democrats could well take back the House in 2026. The Republican majority there is so slender that a normal midterm election would put the Democrats back. And that could then give rise to, the view that, well, the Democrats have solved their problem. But I think that the longer-term horizon suggests that the Democrats have deeper problems than a midterm victory in the House will solve. If you look at what has happened, not just in this election, but culminating in this election, the Democratic coalition that the party has long believed in has fractured considerably. The white working class voters have been moving toward the Republicans for some time. In this election, Hispanic working class voters, particularly men, moved toward the Republicans. Some African American men moved toward the Republicans.
Young voters.
And young voters, particularly young men.
Yeah.
There's been a divergence among young men and young women. That is a problem. Donald Trump, this comes from my friend Ron Brownstein. Donald Trump has won 25 states in the past 3 elections. In those 25 states, the Republicans have 22 governors, 24 state legislatures, and all 50 senators. The Democrats have a problem winning in enough places to be able to really be a majority party, and particularly to have consistent hopes of winning the Senate. 2 other things. We know that the college, non-college split in the country is, in many ways, the basic fault line now.
Yeah.
About 40%, maybe slightly less, of the voting age population has college degrees. Kamala Harris got about 55 or 56% of that vote. The rest of the population, without college degrees, Trump got 56% of that vote. That is a problem that the Democrats haven't solved and need to solve. It's another statistic that I found last week, and that is that Donald Trump won among voters in households with incomes below $50,000. First time, I can't go back indefinitely, but it's going back into the 90s. It's the first time that's happened. He won among voters from 50,000 to 99,900. Kamala Harris won among voters with more than 100,000 in household income
So the party
for the first time. So you've had almost this reversal in roles. So these are many of the sort of structural problems the Democrats have got to solve. I think the Democrats will have to go through, in some ways, a similar debate that they went through back in the late 1980s after they had lost 3 elections in a row. I don't know that it's going to go on the left, right, or center and left axis that one did, but there's got to be some hard thinking, and that's a longer-term prospect.
Yeah.
And winning the midterm election doesn't necessarily get them to where they need to be on that.
And there's 2 gubernatorial elections this year, too, New Jersey and Virginia. I think the first electoral stress test to see if the message even works. It'll be Ken Martin's and the leaders in Congress, Hakeem Jeffries, their biggest tests of recruitment and fundraising and all the like. And I know we're getting up on time, student questions, but I want to ask you a joint question, and then you can pick your poison how you want to answer. So it's what's keeping you up at night about your sector and Trump, where the Democrats are, or if you want to end on a more optimistic note, what do you feel hopeful about, kind of full circle from my first question, about where things can go from here 2, 4, 8 years? And I'll reverse it and start with Jason.
So I, kept up more at night by the types of things Cornell was talking about than the types of things I was working on.
Feel free to talk about that.
But I'm kept up at night a little bit by the fact that in the college I teach the introductory economics class, and I feel like we're not sufficiently getting through to people and through to policymakers. And there are certain things we teach where I'm not sure. Should the top tax rate go up or down? I'd rather it go up. There are economists I have an enormous amount of respect for, think it should go down. Maybe they have a different elasticity than I have. Maybe they have a different normative framework than I have. When it comes to understanding something like tariffs, And do tariffs change the trade deficit? Basically, 99.9% of economists agree that they don't change the trade deficit. 99.9% agree the trade deficit isn't inherently a problem. 99.9% would agree that shrinking exports and shrinking imports will make people worse off. And it's not just in the domain of trade, it's in a domain of a number of other things. And just the degree to which the conversation, and to be honest, I think there was some of this in the Biden administration too, more of it than I would like, and even more of it in this administration, has just departed from what it is we do and teach in our classrooms. And how we get back to that worries me quite a lot. So it's not even any particular policy, but how we think and approach them all together. Some of that's this decline in trust in institutions. Harvard is an institution. The way economists think is an institution. Some of that may be on the institutions to do a better job, to be clearer about things, to be more honest. And I think there's a lot of problems a lot of them have had. But I think a bunch of it is, I'm not going to self-flagellate that, people in this White House, and again, you saw some of the same statements from people in the Biden administration when they said, it's been debunked that people pay tariffs. American people pay tariffs. Of course they do. And so that way of thinking makes me pretty nervous.
Well, I welcome any optimism here. I know we're kind of tight on time, and I want to get to students, so I want to kind of open it up to the floor. No, it was phenomenal. But there's anybody who feels particularly the spirit moving them, as a final word before we go to the audience.
So I would say,
spirit's moving Graham.
Quickly, I'm congenitally optimistic.
Yeah.
And I think the resilience that's been demonstrated by the American political system over the centuries is nothing to be taken completely for granted, but particularly in moments when people are shouting, oh my God, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. I think if I look back at it historically, the sky has been falling many, many times, and we've survived. So I would say that seems to be a positive component. Second thing I would say that got a little bit more mixed, but it picks up from Jason. In polls before the election, 70% of fellow Americans were asked, is the country basically going in the right direction or the wrong direction? Said wrong direction. Not at Harvard, we think things are fine. We give our lectures and we tell them people should understand. 70% of people don't agree with that. So I would say we need to have a long soul searching for ourselves about what other people in their misguided ways may think that we don't agree with, or maybe even that we might be wrong.
I'm open to that soul searching as well. Well, this comes the time for audience questions. I don't want you to be afraid. Pretty much ask anything. I believe there are microphones around. I'm new here, you guys aren't, so you should know where they are.
There's two there
and two here. Phenomenal. And so I'll just kind of go around, and we want to ask questions, not make statements, because we want to hear everyone as much as we can. So introduce yourself. I know people tell people where their dorm is or wherever, but maybe what you're studying, and direct your question to someone just so we can keep the flow going.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mohammad Reza. I'm a cross-registrant at HKS from Fletcher School. My question is about Donald Trump's foreign policy. Specifically about Iran. He has made some interesting statements about Iran since the inauguration and even during the campaign. Most recently, yesterday and this morning, he posted on Truth and had a lecture after seeing Netanyahu. I just wanted to ask our professor's opinion on his statements and the policy he's going to apply towards the relation with Iran.
Megan, want to take that?
Sure. Thank you, Mohammad Reza, for the question. I would say when it comes to Iran, the spectrum of possible outcomes is very, very broad. In terms of where I imagine the administration would like to go and where the president might like to go would be to some kind of negotiated outcome. And Iran, as many people in this room will be aware, is in a fundamentally weaker place than it was even 6 months ago, is strategically set back from a variety of reasons. And so there are many people thinking either one, this is the time to push forward with pressure on Iran, or this is the time where the Iranians are going to be willing to negotiate. I think what is going to be very challenging is that if there is a negotiation, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see a negotiation unfold, not in the distant future, this is going to be a sort of negotiation that is much more ambitious than the already very ambitious negotiation that happened under President Obama and led to the JCPOA. It won't just be about Iran's nuclear program. It will be about the 12 demands that Secretary Pompeo made in the first administration of Iran. So I think President Trump would probably like to move in that direction, and he is willing to use very, very serious economic pressure in order to get the Iranians to the negotiating table. But then, the demands are going to be quite, I would say, expansive. And whether or not that can lead to a deal, I think, is an open question. There'll be pressure from a number of sides within his administration and potentially from Israel for using military force. And that will have to be managed in the context of the entire Middle East picture as well.
Thank you. And thank you very much. We're going to go up here. So name and your question, and direct it to someone if you can.
Hi, my name is Sarah Chaudhry. I'm a junior at the college. As many of us may know, at this point, the new administration has put 10,000 USAID workers on leave. Yeah. And I mean, it might be fair to say at this point we're working towards, basically the dissolution of USAID. So what does that mean for the future of humanitarian aid and the role that the U.S. government plays in being a helping hand and friend to, global aid around the world?
Who wants to take this one? Graham?
So we have the good fortune to have a former colleague, Samantha Powers, who was the director of AAD for the last 4 years. And I'm hoping that she'll be coming home before too long and she can say more about this. I think like many other agencies of the U.S. government that have a very positive purpose, the people who support it and the advocates of it have not done a very good job of explaining to Americans what is actually happening that's good for them. But I think the early example of PEPFAR that Jason gave is a great example. There's 10 million people who are alive thanks to that program over the last 20 years, one of the great initiatives of the Bush administration. So I think the fact that the case has not been made, and I think will not likely be made, will mean there'll be a very substantial shrinkage, and then there'll be a lot of people who will be left out.
Thank you so much. Over here.
Hi, thank you for this wonderfully optimistic panel. You're doing great. I'm Ludovic Suan. I'm a senior fellow at the Mossava Rahmani Center, and I'm an economist, so I will ask the question to Jason. Because what keeps me awake at night is the wonderful stance on the Fed independence, the dollar, and the signature of the US. A lot of people are focusing on the trade war, but I'm very worried about what could spook markets. And so I wanted to know what your thoughts were on how this could really go sour between the Dodge and the Plaza Accord being reignited and this idea that the Fed cannot be that independent because everybody's looking at the US and the US dollar and the reserve currency status it has, and so it could have massive seismic waves sent to the rest of the world. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so
He charges extra for investment advice.
Everyone start taking
Good, I will ask my company to pay for it.
Buy and hold index funds. You can all get that advice for free. So I sort of have a same deep wellspring of love for the Fed that I do for my own children. It's just a wonderful, wonderful institution. And I think it's probably going to be fine because it has a lot of independence. And as I said before, there's this incredibly powerful force of the stock market which protects it but doesn't protect things like PEPFAR for AIDS. But on the other hand, if you told me there was only like a 2% chance you were going to kill my children, I wouldn't be focusing on the 98. I'd be focusing on the 2. So I think there is a risk. I think it's more of a tail risk than things like the tariffs. And I think for the risk to really play out would probably take 8 years, the Trump presidency plus his successor. not something in 4 years. Only 2 of the FOMC seats come up in the next 4 years. It's a 12-person committee. It's hard to replace. If the next president, and the most likely scenario for how that would happen is if he appointed partisan hacks and the next person was from his party and did more partisan hacks. But there's also a possibility he did partisan hacks, the next person is a Democrat, and they don't do what Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton did and reappoint their predecessors' excellent picks, but instead picked partisan Democratic hacks. You could have the whole institution devolve. So I'm more worried about the long term. And then the Plaza Accord, currency negotiation, et cetera, that's just a sort of fever dream fantasy. The exchange rate's going to be determined by things like our fiscal policy, not what the Treasury Secretary thinks people will talk about over drinks at Mar-a-Lago.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, down here.
Thank you, and thank you to all the panelists for coming and for Professor Furman, a good lecture this morning. I was curious to you all, it had been brought up recently, kind of President Trump's rhetoric around colonialism and this colonialist mentality. How do you think that will affect our relationship with our allies and kind of redefine America and who they are to the world?
Dan?
I defer to you on that.
So, again, precisely what's the question?
How will our relationship with our allies change if we kind of continue down this path of colonialism?
I think Trump has made very clear America first. Now, again, as Jake Sullivan said, who has been in favor of America second? I mean, generally, American foreign policy has been for Americans first. The question has been a shorter term or longer term perspective on items. And I think what most national security types, including myself, believe is that long-term alliance relationships that were built after World War II by people whom we revere as the wise men, that included NATO and the relationship with Japan and then the relationship with South Korea, have been a pillar of an international order that is largely responsible for the fact that for the last 79 years, there's not been World War III. And has also been responsible for the fact that there's only 9 nuclear weapon states, not 90. So if all of the relationships become transactional and short-term, it's likely those pillars will be undermined. And if they were to be undermined, then your life will be very different for the next period. So I think trying to realize, again, sorry to be professorial, but I think trying to realize that it is very unnatural that there should be 79 years without a great power war. Never happened before in history. It's not an accident. Fantastic accomplishment. So precious, I think, for all of us if we appreciate what it is. And I think the danger in a short-term transactional is that, of course, you can get a little better deal for the moment, but with the consequences over the long run, that pillar could be undermined.
No, go ahead.
Richard, please.
Hi, my name is Ethan. I'm a freshman at the college studying government and Chinese. I was wondering recently when it comes to Trump's agenda with issues such as DOGE and slashing federal funding, and even his appointments for NASA and NSF, which have advocated for slashing the budget. How does that affect American research in emerging technologies like AI, supercomputers, and quantum computers, especially as it relates to our competition with China in the upcoming years?
So, I mean, I have thoughts on this, probably Graham and others do as well. I think most of what's going to matter on AI is what the companies are doing. They're just deploying way more money, way more resources, way more scientists than the government does, than universities do. And he's taken a largely deregulatory approach. And if I had to choose between that and like an overly regulatory approach, I'd rather do the deregulatory approach. So I think broadly, that's sort of fine. I'm more worried about a lot of basic research in areas other than AI. Medical research and what's happened at NIH with that. You know, some of the more fundamental physics which feeds into solid state and the like. I think there's a set of things that aren't nearly as attractive to the investment community, where I think cutting research will be much more consequential and problematic. The next thing I say also is that I do think the better approach is making America better than trying to deny things to China. It was probably worth doing what we did to China, but it didn't work vis-a-vis DeepSeek R1. You could say maybe we need to do even more, but I think that says we need to do more internally. And then the last thing I'll say is I think DOGE is going to be able to affect federal spending vastly less than Elon Musk is currently claiming that it's affecting federal spending. What will matter is the appropriations bills that Congress passes. It'll be hard to pass those bills without Democratic votes. And so my guess is that we're almost in the worst of it now as some of this funding is being paused. It'll come back. Democrats will insist on it, and it may not be cut quite as much as we're thinking sitting here right now.
Are you confident about that sort of across the board? I mean, if you think of some of the targets that they're going after, particularly in research and research institutions, in the great scheme of things, that's a relatively small amount of money in the overall budget, but it could have a huge and very negatory effect.
To be clear, I think the rate of return on federal research is really high. I think it's all downside risk, not upside for federal research. So this is not good. I think that's going to matter less for AI, much, much less for AI than every other area. I just think it may not be nearly as negative as it looks sitting here right now, this moment.
Yeah. Right. So Megan has an initiative in the Belfer Center on technology that's doing this with Michael McQuaid, who's sitting in the front row. So Megan should probably...
Sure, and thank you for mentioning that, and Michael. I would agree entirely with Jason about where you look at the resources that are going into the development of AI and other emerging technologies, a lot of it is in the private sector. The piece that is more government determinative is in the energy world, and we're thinking and doing a lot of that at the Belfer Center and other parts of the Kennedy School and hopefully Harvard about whether the government is in a position to enable enough energy to be generated and produced here in the United States to enable companies to advance frontier models as much as they intend to be advanced in this very short period of time. And a lot of that gets to the question of permitting and regulations and a number of things that the Trump administration says it wants to go after expediting. So I think that remains to be seen. And I think that is one of the places in which government action will have an impact on the pace of technology and emerging technologies.
And Cornell, I know we were talking, earlier about the quality or your perception, lack thereof, of appointments, and I think it's tangential to this question. So I'd love for you to chime in here.
Yeah, I guess the thing I think about is we can look at particular research areas in terms of degrees of vulnerability. But if we think about the institution in which we work, there's a great deal of apprehension about our ability to do our work. The professors on the faculty are a little apprehensive about the ability to do our work, given the way the government is, in fact, conducting itself. So when we have essentially an advisory committee cosplaying as a department, doing things that only Congress can do in terms of authorizing funds, putting people on administrative leave as a proxy for firing them, this certainly can't be good for research, right? This certainly can't represent the most efficient way of allocating research dollars or ensuring that people want to do research in places like NIH. And so my point being here is we have to be concerned about not merely the efficacy of the undoing of government, but also the illegality of it. Like, we need to be very, very clear. There are things that are being done. In other words, when we have essentially interns going into federal agencies trying to disrupt federal payments, this is not lawful, and it certainly can't be research productive. And so I would simply say, I'm optimistic, but I'm kind of concerned.
To put it lightly. And this is going to be our last question, but before we get up to you, I just need to make a point that I think it's so stunning that we are saying the word Doge out loud seriously. And for the people in the audience and watching, and I say this like kind of half jokingly, like this like silly meme from like 2015, 2016 now being spoken from the like foremost minds of our nation, and now somehow as an element of our federal government is astounding. And the impacts of the internet, not just to plug my study group. I can barely wrap my head around it, so I think we need to acknowledge how kind of bizarre that seems. So you're going to be our last question. Take it away for us. Thank you.
Excellent. My name is Derek Dash, and I am one of the senior executive fellows. So I am a communications advisor at the U.S. EPA. I should say soon to be probably, communications advisor. And I apologize for forgetting your names, but my question stretches to the gentleman in the center, because I think I agree with a lot of what you said about the kind of attitudes this administration has taken towards DEI initiatives. And particularly, I think that one of the things that we are seeing is that people that would benefit the most from some of these programs, for example, in my region, Region 8, are rural communities. And those rural communities tend to vote highly Republican. And a lot of the money that came from the previous administration has gone to build, a variety of projects in those to increase quality of life. And one of the things that we are constantly challenged by is how do we communicate that to these audiences? So my question is, what strategies, tactics, messages have you found? Because when we try and lay out the facts of the matter or where this money comes from, it devolves into a negative discussion. So I'd be curious to hear your approach to that.
Yeah, Take us home, Cornell.
I think that this is a point that Graham made in terms of government being a good ambassador for its work. So in other words, describing the goods and services of government in terms that people appreciate, that are tangible, bread and butter. And so when you think about the Midwest, when we think about the Deep South, when we think about rural communities, when you think about Head Start, right? So in other words, all of this instability of government keeps government workers, government programs for delivering services for basically red state America. And we have to it's great to, as Jason does so well, to speak quantitatively. But I've found as an advocate, there are times when you want to empiricize a narrative, and there are other times when you want to narrativize the empirical. So in other words, you got to paint a picture as well as associating it with numbers. And then it also means having the right ambassadors for the message. So in other words, it's not merely having people from Washington talk about how good things are, how good government is. It's also about having people on the ground saying the same thing. We've seen this with the Head Start program, where the Head Start program has released many studies, but they also put little children in commercials. They talk about the head of the Ford Foundation being a graduate of Head Start. They even had me in the documentary film saying, I'm a graduate of Yale Law School and Head Start. The point being is you have to put a face, you have to put a community in front of these programs in order for people to understand it's not faceless bureaucrats. These are your people trying to deliver services to your communities. That's really important in this moment, because if people don't value it, they won't protect it. And by not protecting it, they leave our democracy defenseless.
Thank you so much. And that's time. Wow, what a fascinating conversation. Graham, I can't wait to... Oh, yeah, please give it up for our phenomenal panelists. Hello, thank you. Oh, my gosh. Have I been cut off? I may have been... Oh, no, they will not silence me. I was saying, Dan, you send me a gift link to read Graham's article in the Post. I'm so fascinated. Thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you to the Kennedy School. Thank you to the JFK Forum. We hope to see you at all of our lovely study groups this semester. Don't be a stranger, and get home safely and warmly. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for our moderator.
I appreciate it. Thank you.